In many ways, this series was supposed to run on from the last one that we did, which was The Villages of Paris, where I looked at the life and the art and the music of the different arrondissements. And I was asked to do this again, and I thought, well, look, what I'll do, I'll give it a different slant, and what I'm trying to do is to look at different parts of Paris, less in depth, but particularly through the eyes of the Impressionist painters. And in many ways, the series is going to be an investigation of the way in which this disparate group of people perceived Paris. They're always thought of as a very sort of cohesive group, where in fact they had very different ways of looking at it and very different techniques. However, they did have something very much in common, which is this adherence to the idea of modernity. And this is really what I want to explore today. So I'll be exploring modernity and in particular the role of Edouard Manet, who of course never considered himself as an Impressionist, even though he was the inspirer of the group that would go on to stage the 8 Impressionist exhibitions. So I've called the lecture Ancient Greece or Modern Paris, because this really is what this whole idea of Impressionism is about: a rejection of the past, a leap into the future off the springboard of the past. And the great fight that will spring up around the Salon of 1863 will be between the traditions of the Salon, who are holding on to really, in many ways, what they saw was a disappearing culture, and the effrontery of these people who were glorifying the present moment. It's very hard for us to understand what the extraordinary hubbub was about the Impressionist art. Yet what it really was the crystallization on a canvas of ideas that rejected the past. And particularly in the 20th century, and perhaps you will notice that people are slightly less interested in the Impressionists in the 21st century, but in the 20th century, people felt a great affinity with the ideas of modernity. And this is what I want to look at here. Modernity, what is it, and where did the ideas come from? Well, I want to look at, first of all, someone whom you might not think is connected with the Impressionists, but it was the poet Charles Baudelaire. I'm sure a lot of you will have, studied some of his work. He was a great poet, a kind of considered a decadent poet, who published sort of a landmark work called The Flowers of Evil, Les Fleurs du Mal, and he was taken to court by the French government for scurrilous subject matter, scurrilous language. So in literature, he more or less is the equivalent of what's going to happen to the Impressionists when they attempt to impose their art in 1863. But it's the ideas of Baudelaire that are interesting. He was what was considered a dandy. A dandy is someone who is very interested in his appearance, who puts aesthetics above all things. I mean, the equivalent, I suppose, in England would have been Oscar Wilde. Baudelaire was not just a poet who explores Paris in his work, but also an art critic, and he wrote the very influential piece called The Painting of Modern Life, where he was referring actually to Delacroix and to a very little-known painter now, Constantin Guise, because at the time, even though he was a great supporter of Manet, Manet was not yet painting what will be the beginnings of his Impressionist paintings, right? Manet at the beginning is still working in the tradition inspired by Velasquez. Now, what I want to spend a little bit of time looking at Baudelaire, because the ideas that come out in his poetry are the vision of the modern world that will be taken up in art by the Impressionists. I've taken a very small extract, right, from one of his works called Le Cygne, which is the swan. And Baudelaire is comparing himself to this swan who is scuffling around in the ruins of, Paris, which is being completely completely redone, and we'll look at that in a moment, at the time of the Second Empire. And this poor swan is trying to find a bit of water or a bit of dust in which to survive. And Baudelaire is comparing himself to this swan. So you already have this concept of alienation, all right? Modernity, change, is change, alienation, and it's melancholy. All right, so there's this sense of disruption, the fragmentation of experience. And he says, Paris changes, but naught in my melancholy has stirred. New palaces, scaffolding, blocks of stone, old quarters, all become for me an allegory, and my dear memories are heavier than rocks. So the important thing here is that the experience, the modern experience, is a city experience. It's an urban experience, all right? And he explains his mood and his feeling about, one, change, secondly, the city, and third, this idea of change and modernity being connected with disruption. But there's much more to this idea. These ideas of change and transience and the ephemeral will be something that you will see that is taken up as a technique by the Impressionist painters. So I want to actually look at another poem that he wrote as part of his Spleen de Paris. I mean, the whole parts of the Flowers of Evil are made up in a section called Spleen, which is melancholy, basically. And I've illustrated it with a painting by Boldini, who was an artist, an Italian artist working in Paris at the time. This is a woman who is in semi-mourning, with, of course, by the time you get to semi-mourning, you're allowed to actually wear purple. But I think she, in many ways, illustrates this. And the word actually, to a passer-by. All right? Now, he is what is the modern person, the painter of modern life, the poet of modern life is the man in the crowd, all right? And he's seeing someone, a passerby means someone who is fleeting, all right? So that's the first thing that you need to look at. I want you to look at, as we're reading this, ideas that, or words that relate to transience, the ephemeral, the idea of beauty as being tinged with melancholy, and a certain type of despair which is related to change. Now, the other thing about it is it's the city again, and it's not a friendly city. The street around me roared with a deafening sound. Now, I urge those of you who do read French to go and get this poem. Translations of poetry are always very approximate, all right? In French, you get this idea of aggression, the sound coming out. All right, so this sound, and this is the man in the crowd, who will be the flâneur that we will talk about. And what does he see? Tall, slender, in heavy mourning, majestic grief, a woman passed with a glittering hand, raising, swinging the hem and flounces of her skirt. Agile and graceful, her leg was like a statue's. Now, before we go any further, also, you have here a great ambiguity. I mean, no woman, respectable woman, really should be swinging her hem and showing her leg. So already you've got the ambiguity of the city, all right? The new city dissolves the old ideas of vice and virtue. It's, who are these? Who is this woman? How can I classify her apart from her beauty? And she's graceful, like a statue, and that's almost what she's doing. Tense is in a delirium. I drank from her eyes, pale sky where tempests germinate, the sweetness that enthralls and the pleasure that kills. Sorry, it's gone. A lightning flash, all right? This idea of something sudden happening. Then, nothing, night. Fleeting beauty, all right? By whose glance I was suddenly reborn. Will I see you no more before eternity? Elsewhere, far, far from here, too late, perhaps never. For I know not where you fled, you know not where I go, O you whom I would have loved, and you who knew it. All right, so what you have is this chance encounter, which is fugitive, transitive. It doesn't last more than a minute. And it is also, the poet's account is subjective, right? So this really is the experience of modern life. Transience, the ephemeral, beauty, which has to be eternal beauty, has to be taken from these fragmented experiences. And also this idea of the city which overwhelms deadens the senses. And this will be taken up by Walter Benjamin when he talks about the concept of phantasmagoria, which will be taken up by the great shops, the flooding of the senses and disorientation of the senses. Now, who was this person? The person, Baudelaire, then, really is the consummate character of the flâneur. Now, I'm sure you've all heard of this. Flâner in French means to stroll. You have a lot of expressions in French. To walk is to vegetate. Flâner, or stroll, is to live. Now, flâner had this sense. A flâneur was an elegant, upper middle class male. All right, and I have to emphasise that he must be a male. There was no such thing as a flâneuse. All right. Now, a woman out by herself looking, a woman was to be looked at, as you can see very clearly in this painting by Béraud. She is out there not looking and absorbing the city, the anonymous experiences of the city, and taking them back and creating art and work. She is there to be looked at, and so this man really is the focus of her gaze. The flâneur is this man who is elegant, who is witty, who has time to walk through the new city, absorb the experiences. And here we have two of the quintessential flâneurs. Robert de Montesquieu, who will be taken up as one of the characters, the Comte, isn't it, Carolussin in Proust à la recherche du temps perdu. As you can see, elegant, effete, extraordinary concern with aesthetics, the aesthetic of existence. And the other person, someone who we'll be talking about today, Edouard Manet. Who himself, while not a dandy, belonged to this group of witty, elegant people who frequented the places of the new Paris. And indeed, his first painting, which when he breaks away, or he never really breaks away, when he begins to portray modern life. And I must actually give you here a quotation from Baudelaire, who talks about the heroism of modern life. All right, this modern life, we must talk about the heroism of modern life. The hero will be the painter who can capture the epic of modern times and make us understand that we can be great and poetic in our frock coats and polished boots. In other words, the past is no longer something which is the only cipher of existence. One must be of one's time. And someone wrote about Edouard Manet, saying, Manet personifies the sentiments and customs of Parisians raised to their highest point. All right, so he is the flâneur. And the first painting that he actually does of this group, this upper-class artistic group who will shape the culture of Paris of the 19th century, and indeed much of the 20th century will be a give and take against what Manet produces, paints this musique aux Tuileries. Now here you have again, this sense of fragmentation of reality. Instead of having a nice vanishing point as you would in a Renaissance painting with action and narrative taking place, you've got groups of people, and Manet always includes, or usually includes, himself. There's sort of self-referential. Over here you have, in fact I've got this over here, on the corner you have Manet himself. Behind you have an art critic, Champfleury. Over here you have Baudelaire. Behind him another painter we will refer to, who is Fontaine-Latour. Then we go back to this here. Here you will see, when I blow this up, we have the great musician of the time of the Second Empire, Offenbach. All right? Now, if Manet interprets Renaissance art for the modern man, it is Offenbach who interprets opera for the modern man. You know, La Belle Hélène, La Vie Parisienne is what he wrote. This is Madame Offenbach here, which is probably why he wanted to sort of create a fantasy world that was a bit... here we have the brother of Manet, Eugène Manet, who you will later recognise in the Luncheon on the Grass. And here you have little details down here, these little girls playing hopscotch or playing with buckets and sands, and and Manet's signature is there. So what you really have then with this painting are people taken out of their context, placed together, wittily conversing, but it is a totally new vision of a historic artwork. Now, transience then is the main aspect of modernity. The other aspect of modernity, which will come up again and again in Impressionist art, and particularly in the works of Caillebotte, is the alienation of modern man in the city, all right? And here I just wanted to show you two paintings by Caillebotte. He, of course, when we talk about him, is middle class, very much like Manet. Paris on a rainy day. Now, you have groups of people who are almost robot-like, right, automatons, all with the same umbrella, all with the same dark clothing, basically manipulated by this new Paris of Haussmann, all right, the new streets which are looking threateningly slippery, the new buildings which look as though they're coming right at you, this city of alienated spaces where no one talks, no one looks at each other, and in fact these people, this man here, if we follow him, would actually collide with these two characters here. So it's an alien space, a disjuncted space. And you also get this from these pictures of a man from his balcony. And again, they're practically always an adult male bourgeois who's standing in many ways in a very sort of slightly melancholy, slightly depressed way, you know, the slope of the shoulders, but he dominates the new space of Paris. There's a woman out here who is if you actually brought the vanishing point, you would see that she is the object of his gaze. Again, the idea of the gaze being terribly important for the flâneur. But this is a landscape which is almost like a lunar landscape. This is the new Paris of Haussmann, but there's no real life. The trees look pretty straggly. It's a barren, inhospitable land. And here you have the same thing, this man leaning out into the city. This is Boulevard Malherbe. We actually, when we're going on the tour, we were actually going to pinpoint where these places are. He's right up here in one of the balconies. But you almost have the impression that he's being pulled down by the city. Now, what other aspects are there to modernity? And this is what I want to look at. What were the other things that influenced the beginning of the Impressionist way of seeing and their subject matter and their technique? Well, the first one is the Paris of Baron Haussmann, or Napoleon III. Now, those of you who have been to my lectures probably think I'm being paid off by the Napoleonic family. But it's just that it is terribly important. Now, this is a painting clearly of Paris 1900. As you can see, the Grand Palais and the Pont Alexandre, the Alexandre III Bridge, which were only built in the 1900s. But I wanted to use this to give you this idea of Paris City of Light. And it still is. Even in the middle of winter with 20 students around you, it still absolutely rocks your socks. Now, Napoleon III, as you know, came back from exile, was voted as Prince President, and then in a coup d'etat in 1852, takes over as Napoleon III. He's the nephew of Napoleon Bonaparte I, doesn't take the title Napoleon II in deference to Napoleon's son, who died in exile. Now, when Napoleon comes to power, as you know, he has decided that he is not going to go back into exile or be beheaded or defeated as other people, all the other kings and emperors in the 19th century had been, and he had located the problem as being with Paris itself. And so he comes with a plan for the reconstruction of Paris and gives the mandate to Baron Haussmann, who is this austere Protestant figure here. Now, what is going to happen is that for 20 or 30 years, because even after the fall of the Second Empire, the reconstruction will continue. Paris becomes a building site where the centre is pulled down, not just the slums around Notre Dame, but also even buildings that had been built in the 17th century, 18th century as well. He had a plan with axes, as you will see here. I'm sorry I didn't manage to translate that. But this is the new Paris, which is, sort of has sabre cuts through it. Some people still think that he was a kind of the Jack the Ripper of Paris. Other people, of course, think that Paris today wouldn't be what it is without Haussmann. In fact, of course, it is. And you see these extraordinary sort of architectural visions. This, of course, is the Opera. You can see the way in which the buildings are aligned, the symmetry, the majestic roads that lead up to a vanishing point that has a magnificent building. So the city itself becomes spectacle. This is a particularly good map, but as you know, it's all around here on the inner boulevards. He will construct the inner boulevards around there, and all the middle part will be taken over and sold off to the bourgeoisie. So the inner part of Paris becomes this playground of spectacle, like a theatre backdrop to the middle classes, and the people who have been dispossessed will be pushed to the outskirts of Paris. So for the first time, you get a real social division that is a geographic and social class division, which of course is going to bring about huge problems and will eventually be responsible for the bloody revolution of 1871. But what I'm really trying to say about Paris is, we're going to mention a little bit the ideas behind it, but it is now a new city. All right, you saw with Baudelaire, he's worried about the idea of change. Well, it is not just a few new buildings gone up, it's a whole new way of being. Public space now has been opened up to women. You know, with the great rise of the department stores, with the rise of the banks, women are brought out of the home as consumers. You no longer have that wonderful division of virtuous women at home and prostitutes on the street. Now you have women out there. Prostitutes now can buy their clothes in these enormous stores. Who is who? What is what? So the street becomes an ambiguous movement. And as you saw in that poem where he says the deafening roar of the city, this is something, again, new. We now have public transport down these massive boulevards. This, of course, is Pizarro's Boulevard des Italiens, Boulevard Montmartre. You can see the noise and the clatter that would have arisen from here. You have the crowds on the newly formed footpaths. It is a totally different idea of who owns the space and who uses it. Napoleon III wanted to reconstruct the city according to make it, first of all, politically safe, so that you couldn't have uprisings and people could immediately shoot you off in the little alleyways of medieval Paris. That was raised. Military caserne, barracks are put on the corners so that cannons and the cavalry could be brought out. It was a safe city, but it was a ceremonial city, and it was a city of light. Right? So that it becomes the cultural magnet of Europe. But is also based on medical ideas of the time, the idea of movement as being important. So the main boulevards are like the arteries with the continual movement of blood through the body, like Harvey. You also, this is just actually sort of showing you how the city is divided up between the middle class in the middle and in the centre, and on the outskirts, these poor people. But you also have lungs, and the lungs of the city will be all the gardens and the woods around the peripheral parts of Paris. And you will also have, with a body, you have to have evacuation, and you will then have the first coherent system of sewers. Now, I mean, this is revolutionary. In other words, he didn't just make it beautiful on the top, according to hygienic ideas, but also constructed sewers. Now, this, of course, was the sewer in 1810. It was the only one that existed. And you can see the way in which the street was like a V, and all the rubbish flowed in the middle. So if you're walking along there, of course, you're splashed. And when we go to Montmartre, you can actually still see some of these little streets where you have that evacuation towards the middle. Well, of course, in winter, you know, with the horse dung and all the rest of it, no, you know, toilets, you can imagine what it was like. But this was the only one which existed, whereas by 1858, huge sewers were built right throughout Paris. So this then is the new city, which influences the idea of change. But it's not just the new city itself, it's the rise of technology, right? Now, the 1850s, we're looking at, in France particular, the fruition in many ways of the Industrial Revolution. And you are going to get the enormous development in the railroad system. And I cannot emphasize enough how important to art this development of the railroad system was. First of all, in vision, all right? Instead of walking along or by yourself or going in a fairly slow carriage, you now began to go at what was considered incredible speeds. And as you look out of the window, your vision of reality is fragmented. Everything, you see it blurred. Well, I see it blurred all the time, but I mean, these people see it blurred occasionally. So I'm very impressionist. And so this experience of speed, this experience of modernity is something which will be taken up in the brushwork of the Impressionists. How can you now actually paint, you know, beautiful outlines and varnish it and have this stasis and stillness when this is no longer the way you see things in the modern world? But it wasn't just this vision, the fleeting vision, that was important. It was the new monuments, the monuments of modernity. And Monet, in particular, becomes fascinated with the great stations, the Gare Saint-Lazare, the Gare de Lyon, but in particular the series that he paints here. And instead of painting Gothic cathedrals, as you would, the new architecture, the Gothic, which is the equivalent of the cathedrals, are the great stations that rise dizzyingly with these steel and iron girders, with huge pieces of glass that let in the light. And of course, the wonder of the modern age, the steam engine. And all of this, of course, lets in the light. And Monet is less concerned with the heaviness of all of this than with the way in which it dissolves under light, right? And we'll talk in a moment about the new science of light. Behind, and in fact you can go to the Gare Saint-Lazare and you can stand and you can still see exactly this vista with the new Paris of Haussmann behind. So this idea of hygiene brought in by Napoleon III, you must have movement, you must have light, translates in the canvas as the apotheosis of light. And again, you can see the way in which they work, or he works in particular, with the way in which smoke has dissolved all of this structure. But again, this is dominated now by the steel girders, which are the new palaces in many ways, or the equivalent of the palaces of the Renaissance. Now, Caillebotte paints the bridges, and for him, again, it has the same significance. Again, monuments. Now, of course, the people at the Salon, when we start to talk about this, will think, but this is absurd. Why are you painting this? This is vulgar. This is modern. This is not worth painting. It's the past which is of great importance. But the painters of the Impressionist movement say, il faut être de son temps. One must be of one's time. Now, what you get here, very importantly in this painting, is the dynamism of the new Paris, right? Now, you're led into the picture by the dog, and this fellow here, of course, would be the equivalent of the flâneur. He's active, all right? He's strolling, but he's not just absorbing, passively absorbing. He's actively gleaning the experiences of the modern world. And opposed to him is this man who is the badaud, which is the sort of the person who stands and goggles. What's the expression? Stands and, well, anyway, you know what I mean. So he's just passive. He's looking as well, but in a passive way. He's not possessing the city. He's not taking up the essence. And again, this idea of the dynamism going across to the new Paris of Haussmann behind. And as you can see, the emphasis is on light and space. Even when there's a sense of claustrophobia, you still have the flâneur elegantly dressed, right? Dominated here in many ways by this massive structure of the new steel technology. Now this is before Eiffel, right? This painting would have been done probably in the 1860s, late 1860s. So Eiffel's Tower, of course, will not be till 1889 at the exhibition, the Universal Exhibition. But he's placed here, and again you have the character here who's just looking. This man is upright and absorbing. Most of the Impressionists will paint, again, the wonder of the steam engine. Here, the new bridges on the outskirts of Paris, and even with Signac will paint, and this I think is in the collection at the National Gallery of Victoria, the gasometers at Clichy. Now, I mean, what is beautiful about that? I mean, this is one of the things which just outraged the people at the Salon. You know, what will you be painting next? You know, toilets. Now, the other thing that I want to, you know, emphasise here with technology is the idea of communication. The world has shrunk incredibly. And here we have Alexander Bell in 1876 with the development of the telephone, and this spreads incredibly to Paris. And by 1881, you've got this contraption called the théâtrophone, which was a system that you could subscribe, and you could listen to the opera or the theatre. This was in different places, on the street or in the shops. And in fact, Proust was a great fan of this sort of thing. And here you have this sort of lady, she doesn't even really need to go out with the gentleman in the back. She can listen to it on the telephone. So this is a sense of communication, that life is speeded up, that nothing now is distant. And also we have the invention of leisure. Now this you may think that I'm exaggerating here. People had spare time, but who was it? It was the aristocracy. The aristocracy didn't work. That was the whole basis of what you were, right? Your income was awarded to you because of your status. Well, now with the new Paris, the new world, the Industrial Revolution, the rise of the middle classes, the rise of banking, of commerce, you now have the middle classes who want to show also that they have leisure. Leisure is related to culture. So now the middle classes want to be cultured, and there are laws that are brought in giving the working classes 1 day off a week. So people now travel. And people now, and if you actually look at much of the work of the Impressionists, you will find that they follow, their paintings outside Paris follow the new railway lines, right? Here you have Monet's The Picnic, the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, and this is actually referring to a sort of lower middle class family. You can't see it particularly well, unfortunately, but there's a man here who's actually not a tour guide exactly, but has worked, prepared the picnic, got them in the carriages and brought them outside Paris on their day off, and they're having a picnic on the grass. Now this is something which was new, right? People didn't do before, all right? The aristocracy had their own pleasure gardens, but there wasn't anywhere you could do this in Paris. Now you can do this by going outside. And of course you get this wonderful, so some people think it's wonderful, painting of leisure by Renoir, which is just outside Paris, and we'll be going there to the La Fournaise. Rowing became a really important sport. This person is a rower, these people are rowers. A lot of the people who came out here, the guinguettes, the cabarets were all outside Paris, and Renoir used to come out here himself and painted his future wife, and I really do like the dog, if nothing else. Now, the other thing which is very important at this time are scientific developments, right? Now, the first one is the science of light. Now, I don't know whether you've heard of a French chemist whose name was Chevreuil, who was an extraordinary man. I've actually got some pictures, some photographs of him by Nadar. Who lived to 102. So he actually lived through the French Revolution right through to the Third Republic, and was actually someone who worked on the development of fatty acids and soaps. And stearic acid, is it, that he isolated was his invention. But at the same time, he was employed by the Gobelins tapestry factory, and they complained bitterly that sometimes the black in the tapestry didn't look as black when it was against other colours. And he, being a scientist, became interested in the study of light. And this is his chromatic wheel, where he shows that a colour changes in its tonality according to the colour next to it. And he actually, and this will be the basis of the Impressionist palette, right, showing that shadows are not uniformly black. They are actually constructed by other colours. And this is a very complex wheel, but it actually basically works on the three colours, the three primary colours, where you've got red, blue and yellow. And it shows that this colour here, shadow, is the combination of the other two primary colours. So the shadow of red is the combination of blue and yellow, which is green. Now this was already, you see, people think of the Impressionists of sort of suddenly waking up on sort of Sunday morning, 1836, and thinking, oh golly, I think I'll do an Impressionist painting. In actual fact, it's been developing all along. And here we have Delacroix, the great romantic poet, painter, who at the end of his life this could be an Impressionist painting. This is the Siet Dieppe, the way in which he has painted the brush strokes, which are very sort of clearly showing the presence of the painter, but he is using this chromatic structure which was developed by Chevreuil. Now, if any of you are interested in this, have a look at Delacroix's Women of Algiers, and you can actually see very clearly the beads on the women reflect this idea of different tonalities. The other thing that was going on at the time also was this idea, there was work on molecules and atoms, and people were beginning to realise that nature is made up of small, very small pieces that you cannot see, all of which are bound together by energy. And in fact, the basic substratum of the universe in many ways is this frenetic movement or energy. And this, even though you know, Monet clearly wasn't a scientist, these ideas filter down. Maybe people meeting in salons, people talking in cafes, rise of newspapers, ideas about this were spreading quickly. And you can see this when you look at this painting by Monet. The movement, almost this vibration of the canvas with energy and with light. Also, this goes through into the amusement field or into the field of entertainment with a great American performer, Lois Fuller, who performed in America, not to great acclaim, the Serpentine dance. She used to dance swirling huge pieces of chiffon, and she is actually one of the originators of a certain type of dance, and she held patents also for fluorescent pigments that you could put on material and use with light. So you can see that her whole basis of her act, which mesmerised Paris, and she went on tour as well for something like 15 years, is based on the importance of light and the swirling, all right? Now, she was actually a dumpy little figure, but you can't see that at all under the swirling chiffon, which probably has a lesson for all of us. So. Now, the other rise of technology that is important, which you don't actually think of, is that painters now could move outside the studio because of developments. First, they no longer have to mix their pigments on the spot because tubes of painting have been developed, so they can take their tubes and go outside. Secondly, they have folding canvases and they can take them. They don't have to stretch their canvases and nail them. So all of this has made it much easier. And thirdly, there has been a lot of chemical experimentation, and particularly in the field of bright colours, right? You're getting the development of very, very deep blues. You're getting Perkins purple, who that was discovered by someone who was actually doing some work on leprosy in England. Then you get the bright greens as well. So new colours, new ways. And here we have Courbet, who was one of the great first outdoor painters, showing the new status of the artist. Now here he is looking a bit like an Assyrian, and he's greeted by his the person who has given him an order to paint his portrait, and the poor servant behind. Bonjour, Monsieur Courbet. He's hailed as an artist, but he's no longer some fop in a studio. He's out there in the landscape with his canvas on his back, all right? So this is the new artist, someone who is identified with the outdoors. And this brings us to the next important thing, is that you have the development before the Impressionists of the Barbizon painters. Barbizon is an area near Fontainebleau, south of Paris. Daubigny, Corot, Rousseau already were painting landscapes in situ, right? They were no longer going back, taking a sketch, going back to their studio. They had set their easels up outside. And the great painter Courbet, the great realist painter Courbet, was also painting not just landscapes, but figures in landscapes. This, unfortunately, was destroyed during the bombing of Dresden, but there are a number of photographs of it. But he adds social commentary, Courbet does. Here, of course, this boy who's too young to be carrying this stone, this old man who's too old to be doing this, and this idea that this is all that he can aspire to as he gets older, is to be doing the same degrading work in utter poverty. So you already have this, with the rise of the New World, rise of socialism as well. Now, another influence on art and culture at the time, which was profound in the way in which the Impressionists will work, is what is called Japonism. Now, I believe there's some people here who actually have their own prints of these people. Hiroshige, who painted the Ikkeiyu, I can never pronounce this, the Ikkeiyu, the painting of the floating world. Now, these people were painters who painted everyday life in 19th century Japan, called the Edo School. And their work arrived in Paris of the 19th century when Japan opened up to trade with Europe. And these prints, which were block prints and were, produced in great number, were used to wrap up pottery and porcelain which was being sent to Paris. And it was the first way in which these prints arrived and became popular. And you will find that the Impressionists, particularly Monet, but others are great collectors of these prints. Now, the important thing about them is that you have, first of all, no perspective, all right? This is completely away from Renaissance art. You have dark outlines, you have very unusual perspectives, sometimes from above, sometimes from below. You don't have a complete picture. So this starts here and then just suddenly goes out of the screen or out of the frame, and you will notice that this technique will be used a lot, in particular by Degas. All right, so you no longer have the centering, the vanishing points, the narrative. There's no narrative whatsoever, and all of this will be taken up by the Impressionists. The other one, of course, is Hokusai. Now, I just need to quickly get through this so I can. I am actually going to get on to Manet. You'll be pleased to hear. You'll feel a little bit like the flâneur. Oh no, never. Photography was the other great influence on Impressionist art. The great photographer of the time was a man called Félix Tournachon, who took on the nickname as Nada, and produced great psychological portraits. I mean, it's unbelievable. One of the first photographers in Paris should produce, he managed to portray the psychology of his sitter in very difficult circumstances. You had to keep that pose for a very long time. Now, what was the importance of photography? Well, photography now takes over the capturing of reality. The painter no longer has to play that role, and in many ways it frees painting from narration, from being tied to depiction of the outside world. Art can now do something else in its recreation of reality. Now, we have looked at, in other words, all of these influences, the transience of modernity, the ephemeral, this struggle to construct an identity in a changing, slightly alienating city. And the artists who were going to try to depict this modern experience, this fragmented experience, were going to come smack up against the bastions of the old world, or the bastions of culture and society, and this is the Salon. Now, the Salon was produced or developed in the 1700s. It originally was every 2 years, and by the time we get to the time we're interested in, it is now every year. It was a great social event of the year. You get something like 500,000 people going through it when you think about blockbuster exhibitions. I mean, there were, you know, in the 1850s, you had as many people interested in art coming to see what is happening. The great night, the social night of the year, was the vernissage, right? When people came along and put the last layer of vernis, the last layer of lacquer on their painting, and that was if you were anybody, you were invited to the vernissage. And so you still get, if you're invited to the opening in France, it's still called the vernissage. Now, the Salon was important because if you were an artist, this was at a time when you would depend entirely on orders from the state. There wasn't the network of little galleries that we have now, on which would spring up towards the end of the 19th century. So to be viable as an artist, become famous, you had to compete at the Salon. If you won a medal, you would be given the Prix de Rome, the prize of Rome, and you would be sent to Rome for 3 years. And if you became a Prix de Rome, you then would become part of the jury of the next Salon. Now, this actually is the Salon of 1824. I've just wanted to show you the way in which the paintings were hung. Now, I mean, people with bad eyesight forget it. It was dark. They were very much, very, very high in the ceiling, very difficult to perceive. And where you were hung was extremely important, all right? The more famous you were, the lower you were, and there was an expression, I can't sort of remember what it is, but, you know, he's someone who's on the ceiling, and it related to where you were placed. Now, what did the Salon actually represent? It represented, first of all, the ideas about art were held tightly by the Salon. Firstly was the great hierarchy in art. The most important paintings were those that were history paintings, and they were the biggest ones. You didn't ever paint a big still life, you only painted big history paintings. History or mythology were number one, and of course you needed life figures, you needed to be out there, and this excluded women in many ways from becoming a great painter because they couldn't participate in that level or type of painting. The second in the hierarchy was portraits, then you got landscapes, and then right at the very bottom you get still life or genre scenes. Now, of course, the Impressionists are going to upend that hierarchy completely, and in fact banishing mythology and history totally from the structure of their paintings. It wasn't just the hierarchy that was imposed by the Salon, but it was the idea of what art is. Art was morally uplifting. Art, through its aesthetics, was supposed to give you a sense of religion, a sense of patriotism, a sense of the glory of participating in the tradition of Western art and Western civilization. All right, so it had a kind of didactic attitude behind it, of course. And so, you know, when the Impressionists start painting sort of nudes lying on the grass, you know, this is totally contrary. It's futile. What is the point of even wasting the pigment on the canvas? It was also turned towards the past. The past, you drew inspiration from the past. The present really was of no value. It was only a reflection of the great ideas of the past. And the most important thing in art was narrative. It told a story that you could identify with and that you could be taught. So it is no surprise in many ways that, of course, the Impressionists will not be accepted. Now, the people who governed or who chose the art that would be hung was the jury, and this was composed of people who had won the medals the year before. In other words, people who had adhered to the ideas of the Salon. So the jury, by its very nature, was extremely conservative. They weren't going to admit new ideas or new people. And this is how they voted. You know, that thousands of paintings would be brought in and you'd raise your umbrella, yes, it can be hung or whatever. And so it was a rather slipshod. Then a lot of nepotism, of course, went on. The people who managed to get through were people who studied at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts, which is just down the road from where Manet lived. It was very difficult to get in here, and in fact Manet himself and virtually none of the Impressionists ever went through the great portals of the École des Beaux-Arts. All right, it was the bastion of the antique, right through until the 1900s. You've still got sort of Aphrodite coming out of the water and so on. Now, this was the kind of painting that they loved, all right? This was by Jacques-Louis David, the intervention of the Sabine women, nudes referring to a glorious time in the past of the conflict between Rome and the Sabines, the glory, you know, the great uplifting story of the woman who stands in the most unlikely position between two naked men saying, no, 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 you know, okay, we were carried off, but now we're the mothers of the children and so on. Peace, all right? So the great history paintings make you relive the past of the Western world and gives you the uplifting idea of peace. And it relates to what's going on in the present time. It means that, you know, people who in the revolution, perhaps some people sided with the royalists, some people were revolutionaries, you must come to some kind of peace. So, all right, the past teaches the present. And it's a narrative. You read it, you can identify it. Oh, yes, there's Laertes and so on. The other kind of painting which was accepted were these sugary religious scenes, bourgeois, again with, I mean, it really can't get much more sugary than that. Here we have these which are sort of basically soft porn, but I mean in an artistic sense, Venus rising from the sea and holding a pose. You also have, again, slightly sort of eroticization of women. Women are objects of your view. You will notice that, you know, they've always turning away from you. These are the exotic paintings of Henner and Gérôme. Here we have history painting, a sort of a caricature courting the bourgeois lady of the time. Now, it all comes to a head in 1863 when the person who was in charge of the Salon was the Count de Neuwerkerque, the lover of Princess Matilda. Now, Princess Matilda was the cousin of Napoleon III. And he was responsible for rejecting something like 4,000 canvases. And there was a huge uproar. Meissonier, who's the great artist of the time, also, one of his was accepted, but he backs these people who were rejected. They write a letter to Neuwerkerque, who takes it to Napoleon III, and Napoleon III, to boost his popularity, to show that he is one with, you know, new art and so on, opens what is called the Salon des Refusés, the Salon of the refused canvases, all right? This is at 1863. This was the painting that got the prize of Rome, the Prix de Rome, and you can see why. It's an allegorical or it's mythological. You've got the nude doing the right thing. She's got no pubic hair. She's an idealized woman. She knows her place. She's looking coy, showing off her body, but not, you know, no intellect, no subjectivity. She's just simply the object of our view, and the flesh is beautifully moulded. There's vanishing points. You cannot see any trace of the painter, all right? It is the vision that you are supposed to plunge into and enjoy. So this was the one that was chosen and bought by Napoleon III. However, he decided that this painting, amongst others, the Lunch on the Grass of 1863, which really is the turning point in modern art. I've only got half an hour to do all of Manet, so I have to speak really fast from now on. Manet, who was he? He was a sort of a wealthy upper middle class man. His father was a judge. His mother belonged again to the upper class. She was a daughter of a diplomat. And he finally was allowed by his father to take up painting after he'd failed abysmally as a sailor. You can see him here. He's the elegant man about town, and he lived in the, this is the Rue Bonaparte here. All right, the École des Beaux-Arts is here, and this is where Manet actually lived with his family. So he lives in this very upper-class neighbourhood of Saint Germain, as you know it. He was sent to study at the very traditional studio of Thomas Couture, and we'll see this painting at the Musée d'Orsay, Romans of the Decadence, all right? So in 1863, you have Couture producing, with all of this that's going on, with Baudelaire and the flâneur and the city, where are we? We're back in ancient Rome, all right? But however, Manet learns his technique from there. He also studies at the Louvre, all right? Now this is very important for the formation of Manet. Everyone, even if you go through the Louvre now, you'll see people actually buy the right to go and copy, women in particular. He was fascinated, I'm sorry about the reproductions of this, by Velasquez and Goya in particular. And many of his first works are not reproductions, but are inspired. The stance, the characters, the colours, the tones come definitely from his exposure to Spanish art. Louis-Philippe had a vast collection of Velasquez, which was sold back to the Prado at the fall in 1848. Now, Manet was a boulevardier, all right, himself. He wasn't at all someone who lived in Montmartre, and he maintains this status throughout his life. He moves, in the 1860s, he moves north to Batignolles. And here we have a painting of him at the head of the Batignolles group. Now, here we have Manet, we have this person here, Astruc, who will be quite important. We have Renoir, the great critic Emile Zola. Here we have Monet and Bazzi, also an Impressionist painter who will die during the uprising of 1871. So he is perceived by Fontaine-Latour as definitely the inspirer of the group that will become the Impressionists. Now, where is he now? Well, you see he has moved from the Saint-Germain-des-Prés, which is around here. He's gone all the way to the right bank, which is a very audacious move, up to the Batignolles area here, which is just next to Montmartre. And by the way, we'll be staying just there. So we're going to be really right in this Impressionist quarter here. So this is going to be the area that he will paint incessantly. Just a little bit about his life. He marries his piano teacher, a most unlikely, lumpish sort of woman, by whom he'd probably had this illegitimate child, whom he passed off as her younger brother. It's amazing what you can do. And he finally married her when his father died, but never actually formally adopted this child. Now, who you will actually see in a lot of the paintings, the Pfeiffer, for example, is that child. Now, getting back to the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, why did it cause such a hubbub? Well, what was it about it? Now, the first thing about it, I suppose, is what sort of a painting is it? You look at it and you think, well, look, there are three people sitting talking. Someone looks as though she's doing a bit of washing in the background, and then you've got this sort of picnic that someone's, thrown on the grass. I mean, what is going on? I mean, what is the story? I mean, how does it stick together? In other words, there is no narration, right? It's a confusing painting. You can read into it anything you like. I mean, it is up to the spectator to make sense of it. The painter makes no sense of this grouping at all. There is no message. No message in the narrative, that is, right? Secondly, what sort of painting is it? Is it a figure painting? It's got three figures and a small one. Or is it a landscape painting? You've got birds up here, you've got trees. Or is it a still life painting? You've got this ridiculously strange still life. It can't be a picnic because there's one roll and there's three of them. You've got sort of cherries and figs and things which aren't available at the same time of the season. So it's all very, very confusing. The other thing is that no one really communicates with each other. There doesn't seem to be any relationship between this person and this group here. In fact, the only person who is making any eye contact at all is the person in the centre. And who is she looking at? Who is she looking at? Yeah, she's looking at the painter or the spectator. So in other words, what this painting is doing, it is expanding the canvas to include all this space out here. All right, you now are being interrogated by this person rather than you, the spectator, interrogating the painting for meaning. So it's upending the whole visual experience that was normal up until then in the 19th century. Now, the other thing that is very important here is the upending of the convention of the nude. All right, now the nude, as we saw, was either, you could have a nude woman doing anything so long as she represented an allegory of history or an allegory of poetry, or if she were a goddess, or if she even is a slave girl, but, you know, shows sufficient pudeur, you know, hiding her eyes and showing everything else off. This, of course, doesn't happen at all here. She's not only completely, inexplicably naked, but she's not ashamed about it at all. In fact, she's looking straight at us and saying, well, so what, right? Now, the other thing is that she's not a nude, right? Get the difference between naked and nude. The nude is the perfect, unclothed figure of antiquity, but this woman is simply someone who is naked. She's taken off her clothes, and to make the point really clear, there are the clothes. All right, so, and these aren't allegorical figures. In fact, they're people we know. This woman is actually a painter. She's not a prostitute. I mean, people have often said that she's a courtesan. She wasn't. She actually exhibited and had paintings shown in the same room as Manet himself. This is Manet's brother-in-law, and this is his brother as well. So you've got these people from the present day who really could be in the room. I mean, you might actually see them as you look around. So there's no time frame at all. More important, apart from this confusion of upending those ideas, is the technique that is used. This is the first painting which is art about art. Manet goes to great lengths to show the presence of himself as a painter, all right? And he does this by actually showing it, making it look as though it's all these brushstrokes which have been put on. Now remember that Renaissance art has finished work. You can't see, it blends in, all right? Now what he's done is put great patches of colour like the Japanese prints. There's no modelling, right? You get the white of her flesh against the green of the background. There's no chiaroscuro, you know, there's nothing blending between the two. You get colour on that. But Manet has actually spent ages putting on paint, scraping it off, putting it on to make it look patchy, all right? He didn't just do this, walk outside and paint it. It took him years, or not years, long time in the studio to produce that impression of the ephemeral brushstroke, all right? And he's emphasising the painting coming into being, all right? And that is extremely important. He has also thrown out the ideas of perspective and the vanishing point. She's too big, in actual fact, if she's the correct version here, and all of this is too large as well. Now, what Manet also is doing, this is the reaction of the public, I mean, they're just outraged, is that he is modelling. It wasn't just sort of any old painting that he took up. He actually is modelling his work on a Renaissance print by Marcantonio Raimondi, The Judgment of Paris, which was a print that was made from a work by Raphael. So he is quoting Raphael, and he is also, we can see quite clearly, can't you, the way in which the figures here, also quoting the Fête Champêtre by Giorgione or Titian. It was thought to be by Giorgione at the time. Again, these two clothed men with naked women sitting around. Now, this was in the Louvre, and so Manet would have seen it. So what he is saying basically is, I am taking the past, and I know how to do it. This is clearly, I'm taking the subjects, I know how to paint like this, but I don't want to. This is the painting of modern life. This was clearly the Bois de Boulogne. These are clearly modern people. This is the new art, right? It is not about illusion. It is about the structure and the fragmentation, the confusion of modern life. And this, he is, in other words, taking a step back to spring forward into the future with this piece of art. Now, he was defended by the critic Emile Zola, who of course is the great writer who will write about Paris of the 19th century. Manet was not dismayed by the most extraordinary hubbub that his Déjeuner sur l'herbe had produced, and he went ahead and submitted 2 more works to the next Salon, one of which is this most extraordinary, unlikely Christ mocked by his jailers. When you think of Manet, you don't think of this, do you? But this was his early work, and this is inspired by Velasquez as well. So he showed that and Olympia. I mean, you couldn't get the contrast much greater. Now, this time, he wrote a letter to Baudelaire, who was by now in the last stages of syphilis and drug abuse in Brussels, depressed as well, and said, look, I've finally had my painting, you know, you didn't actually have to manipulate the jury for me, because Baudelaire was now going to write letters saying that he must have his paintings. But he said, no, it was accepted, but he didn't realise when it was actually hung, the effect that it would create. Right? Now, there was an absolute furor when it was hung in the room with M. Don't forget that in the room with M you would have had Monet, you'd have had Morisot, and we would have had Meissonier. Everyone wanted to see the Meissonier, but you would have had this ghastly thing. Now, why was it so abhorred? You see these women who are just, you know, women who were pregnant were told they shouldn't come, they might give birth on the spot. Oh my goodness, the Venuses of the Salon. Here we have the Promenade au Salon, all the caricatures in the press. People used to accost his relatives and laugh at them in the street because they had the name Manet, little ditties and rhymes, people dressed up as Olympia. It was an unbelievable hubbub, and after a couple of months the people who were running the salon couldn't bear it any longer, and they removed it from where it was and hung it so high that it couldn't really be seen, or actually damaged because people were hitting it with their umbrellas. Now, what was so scandalous about it? Well, firstly, it's very much the same sort of thing. It is this female nude again. Now, again, you have no illusion as to the fact that she is naked, right? She's not a nude, right? She doesn't represent anything. She clearly is someone who is probably a courtesan or a prostitute. Now, this was a sensitive issue at the time. Now, prostitution had been around, you know, it's supposed to be the oldest profession, and it certainly was blooming in 19th century Paris. And with the construction of the new city and the new clothes and the new sort of commercial aspects, prostitutes were everywhere, and they were being, you know, hired everywhere as well. And there was this, you couldn't tell who was an honest woman and who was a prostitute. And some of the great courtesans, as you know, had huge political clout and were very wealthy and had entered into the sort of upper stratosphere of society. So there was this worry about the ambiguity of morals and vice, and how can you tell an honest woman or not? And here she was. It's bad enough having her on the street, but for Christ's sake, here she is in the Louvre at the Salon, being exhibited, being accepted by the Salon jury. What were they thinking of? Is it the end of civilization as we know it? Now, she clearly has taken her clothes off because she still has bits and pieces on. The flower in the hair is a reference to the fact that she's a camellia, a courtesan. This probably would have been this bracelet would have actually had hair or something in it from an admirer. She is clearly sort of drawing attention to her genitalia by putting her hand over it in a kind of a spider or a frog-like position. And so you get the equivalent, you get the cat here, which is supposed to represent what she's covering up, because the French word for a cat, une chatte, is the slang word for female genitalia. So you get all these little witty things that, there's always these little winks that Manet gives you Also, the maid is coming in bearing flowers, obviously from someone waiting outside. And this is a reference also to black women. They were supposed to be hypersexual, all right? And so for heaven's sake, if this hypersexual servant is waiting on her, what would this be? So this fear of female sexuality is added to it. Now, the other thing that people thought was ghastly was that she wasn't moulded. There was just paint there. There was no sort of structure. She's obviously on this, on her bed, which is looking a bit dishevelled, and the painting clearly shows the presence of the artist. Now, there's no story, right? The nude's looking back at us, right? We're actually, exactly as in the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, we could be one of her future clients. Now, Manet has done the same thing with this as he did with the other painting, insofar as he has quoted Titian's Venus of Urbino. Now, you see it very, very similar with the position of the hand. The dog idea of faithfulness is taken over by the aggressive sexual sort of symbol of the cat with the tail sticking up in the air as well. The faithful servant with the wedding coffer is replaced by the lascivious black maid. Also, you would remember the Maya Desnuda, which is supposed to be, wasn't it, the Duchess of Alba, wasn't this one? Again, a reference, so he's wittily quoting these, but saying, I don't want to do that. Now, he will continue to paint from now on. Manet, who will never actually exhibit with the Impressionists, even though he's the leader of their group, he interprets the new concept of modernity, continues to paint aspects of modern life. Here we have the balcony of 1868, the new Paris of the boulevard, where he's experimenting with colour, taking over from perspective, right? We have the impression that these people are behind the rail simply because this colour is brighter than the white which is behind it, and you get this sense of depth simply by the darkness of the colour. There's no vanishing points, and the emphasis on what things look like in the sun, right? The flat space. And again, these are people whom he knew. This was based on the Majas on the balcony, so he's still quoting Spanish art. So in 1874, the other people whom he has inspired up in Batignolles, now when he's at his atelier in Batignolles, each night they go to the Café Gerbois or the Café de la Nouvelle Athènes, they hammer out their ideas, and he will inspire this group to come together to exhibit their art, because they will constantly be refused by the Salon. Now, Manet, right to the end of his life, will continue to attempt to be accepted by the Salon, and indeed he will finally be. Now, I'm probably going to go a few minutes over. I just want to look at this again. This is one of the last works that he does, which is quintessential Manet, and very much this idea of the confused experience of modernity. We have what looks like to be a woman looking at us, all right? And she has this sense of isolation and melancholy. Remember that beauty for Baudelaire was linked to sadness, to melancholy. Here she has this sort of, not a wistful, but a blank expression, right? Where she confronts us, and she's clearly outlined in her confrontation with us. However, if you actually look at the painting, you will see that this is actually her back. And this is done in a much more sort of flou. The outline isn't as clear. In other words, this is more or less the sort of the movement of it. And here she is speaking to someone. Now, if she's looking at us here, how can her back be there? So Manet, again, is playing with this idea of this fragmented sense of perspective, this fragmented experience of the city. You don't know where you are. In fact, you don't really know who you are, do you? Because you think you're talking to her, but in actual fact, you're this fellow here and you're over here. All right, again, you've got this confusion with, is this a figure painting or is it a still life? And in fact, he actually signs, I can't remember, on the label is where he actually signs his name. You've got this beautiful, almost, he was very influenced, by the way, by the Dutch artists, and he studied them, Vermeer in particular, and you get the inclusion of these beautiful elements which are to be bought. So is she really just part of a still life with this outrageous décolleté and the flower in the bosom? Indeed she was. It's a reference to the fact she can be bought like anything else. She also has a price. But that's not the end of the confusion. What looks like just the background, in fact, is a mirror. So she's standing in front of a mirror, and all of this is actually happening over here. And in fact, what is happening, someone actually from there is looking at us as we look at her, not knowing where we are. And then you get the fragmentation of this little person who's probably doing a trapeze act at the Folies Bergère, going up here. So you've got all these elements of, you really start out feeling quite reassured. Oh yes, she's exchanging. In fact, she's not looking at you at all. If you actually look, she's actually looking away constantly. You as a spectator are again part of this fragmented, ephemeral experience. Now, the other painting, of course, that he does, I just wanted to bring that in because it's, he will actually use this. He's great friends by now with Zola, and this character, Nana, appears in Zola's great epic work, the Rougon Macquart. But once again, you will notice, and this is an aspect very important, I think, in Manet's work, the importance of the central female figure. If you look back at the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, the Olympia, the bar at the Folies Bergère, and this one here, it's the central female figure who looks at us, all right, and refuses to be an object. She takes on this great subjectivity. You become an object of her. You are actually in her space. And this is exactly what this woman here is doing. She's undressed, for Christ's sake. I mean, no respectable woman would ever show a toe. But also, this fellow here, the man, is actually literally pushed out of the pictorial space, very much like these Japanese paintings that I was referring to, where you get reality, there's a piece of reality, and you get a frame put over it, and too bad if 3/4 of that person is outside the frame. And there's a reference to the Japanese influence here in the background. But again, she's one of these troubling women whose status is you know, somewhat ambiguous. This was actually Gabrielle Horsa, whose name was Lemon, Citron, because she was the lover of the Duke of Orange. So, I mean, there's all these little sort of puns that sort of go on. And by the way, actually, back in the Déjeuner sur l'herbe, there's a little pun there as well. You've got a little frog in the corner, and then a grenouille is another word for a prostitute. So you get, Manet gives you all these little things. Now, this is actually one of my favourite paintings, and it is, again, this other aspect of modernity, this sense of anonymity, this alienation of a couple, all right, who clearly are married. In fact, she was an American heiress, one of these buccaneers who came over to buy out penniless families from the English aristocracy or the French. But this extraordinary sort of coupling of the two people. Now, they form a couple because of the position of the two heads. However, they are in total isolation of each other. They're sitting on a bench, and you have the bars of the bench. He's behind the bars, and she's in front. And this basically sort of is an allegory in many ways of their relationship. He's looking down towards her hand, and she's looking away there. So there is really no interaction of their glances. Their hands. Now, she's actually taken off her glove, which is really, you know, shows great familiarity, and you actually can see the wedding ring there. But their hands do not touch, and in fact, his hand is occupied with a cigar. So then, again, this idea of distance, this sort of isolation of people in the modern world. And again, interest in the fashion of the time. This is something which was seen as extremely important, you know, with the painter of modern life showing the heroism of their own costumes. Now, the last two that I want to look at, again, refer very much to the life of modernity in Montmartre. Now, this is around where he was living at the time. And again, this sense of distance that you get between the figures. This is actually a cafe on the Boulevard de Rochechouart, which no longer exists. And you have, again, the Japanese influence by the sort of flatness of the characters, by the fact that the main action is sort of partially going out of the picture frame. There isn't really a vanishing point. It's these figures put on top of another, this confusion of modern life, the speed, the capturing of a gesture, and the brushwork, which shows the presence of the artist, all right? It's very carefully not attempted to give, it's attempted not to give it a finished feel, right? You have the impression that things are still happening. Now, the main character here, again, no one looks at anyone else, all right? He's looking that way, she's looking that way, she's paused for a moment. This is one of these women who began to take over the service industry in the cafes of Montmartre. They were called brasseries à femmes. People came along to see these new waitresses, and she's quite confident, in fact, extremely confident, and she forms the sort of main structure of the painting. And behind her, you have a performer who sort of looks a bit odd, but she's sort of just going to do her act. So you've got these three women really in many ways dominating this scene here. This character is a sort of slightly old-fashioned fop, and he's sitting next to a woman who's probably, you get this impression that it's all just happening. She's walked in, she's got a sandwich, a takeaway sandwich even at the time. She hasn't had time to take it out of its package. She's clearly a girl who's a worker, or maybe she's a prostitute. She's certainly not a bourgeois lady. She's smoking, she's got some beer. And she's sitting in isolation from this character. Now, this is one of the aspects that perhaps I didn't mention at the time, was that Paris was a city of strangers. All right, so, at the same time when a survey was taken, in London, something like 60% of the people in London had been born there. At the same time, only 30% of Parisians had been born there. They were people who came in to work on the Great Reconstruction. They were women who came in to work in the service industries, who came in to work as milliners and so on. There were less marriages in Paris than any other city in the world, and there were less children born in wedlock. In fact, the whole Haussmannisation of the city had meant that people didn't have homes, and so they came out to socialise and live in the cafes. And so the cafes gave you the modernity of experience, the nearness, the closeness, and yet the distance. You could sit quite comfortably to someone next door to someone you didn't know at all right, which was something quite unusual at the time. So this then is Manet's take on modernity. I just wanted to show you one of his last self-portraits in 1879. By this stage, of course, the Impressionist exhibitions have been going for years, and Manet has by now been accepted. He'd actually won a second-class medal. He was terribly happy with that, and he'd be given the Legion of Honour mainly because he'd gone through, when he was at high school, the fellow who sat next to him was Antonin Proust, who was now Minister for Culture, and who remembered his old friend Manet and gave him the Legion of Honour. And Manet continued, and he actually wrote letters saying, "Monsieur Manet does not wish to outrage. I am simply a painter of modern life." So he presents himself very much as the flâneur, even in 1879. This is 4 years before his death. He's dressed up, even though he's painting, but he is painted in the sketchy brushstrokes of modern painting. I just wanted to show you this house at Reuil, which is actually in the collection at the National Gallery of Victoria. This is where he will die. He managed to catch syphilis in his 40s. In fact, most people of the time, syphilis was the plague, sort of the AIDS of the time. And there was no cure for it, of course, and people died somewhat agonising deaths. Manet died at the age of 51 after he'd had his leg amputated for gangrene in appallingly difficult circumstances. I don't think, did they have anaesthetics in 1851? No, so it was ghastly circumstances. But right until the end, he sees himself as this painter of modern life, the flâneur, as set out by Baudelaire in our first slide. Now, although he never says that he is an impressionist, he is the person who moves from the realism of the outdoor painters, of the Barbizon group and Courbet, he is the nexus, or forms the nexus of where the discussions and the new work will go on, and it is through him that you will get the development of Impressionist art. Now, next week we will now look at the other Impressionists. I think next week we're starting with Monet and Pissarro. So thank you very much.